Hello, Saints of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is Robert with God, Family, and Country, here again with another great video from an undisclosed mountain valley location within the everlasting hills. As I was thinking about doing a video tonight, be honest, it was a rather long week. However, I figured I would do a video, and I have, let's just say, a lot of either presentations or papers that I've done over the years to help with my studies, and you think that would make it easy to choose, but it doesn't. There's so many to choose from, and sometimes I ask myself if I need to update some things based upon new revelations I've had or new understandings as I continue to constantly study the Word of God and the Word of His prophets and servants here on this earth. So this one I did, I believe, back in early 2019. I put this together, and I decided to talk about this particular one. I have several papers written upon what I'm calling like a Latter-day Saints perspective of God's law, principles of freedom, liberty, and the proper role of government. But before I get into that, just a few housekeeping items. Feel free to, in the video description below, there's a link to my blog, and you'll be able to download absolutely for free this particular presentation to share with others, or make it into a better format. You can add or take away, do with it as you please, even make better than my skills. I don't have great PowerPoint skills, but anyways, this is what I put together for myself, but this is what works for me. And I've even thought about if I can figure out how to do a poll, a YouTube poll or something, or even like something on my blog. Feel free to email me, because I haven't looked, but probably 50-50, either PowerPoint presentations or just Word documents where I've typed up my study notes. So let me know if you prefer me to just, as I come across these different subjects that I put together, if it's in PowerPoint, I'll just give it in PowerPoint. If it's in Word, I'm just going to give it in Word instead of having to worry about taking a Word document and putting it into PowerPoint. So feel free to let me know in the comments, or like I say, if I can get a poll up, or feel free to email me. That is also provided there on my blog and also on this YouTube channel. So that being said, let's get going. This one is the part that I did change is part 1, a Christian constitutional republic. There will be several parts to this, and I just want to go over the what some call Christian constitutional republic, and it's the form of government that Mosiah II established amongst the Nephite people. And then we'll also go through some of the not only the differences in some of the governments that we find in the Book of Mormon, but also some of the things to look out for, as of course the Book of Mormon was written for our day. It's a voice of warning, and therefore we would do well to not only recognize the patterns of righteous government and righteous leaders, but also the opposite, the patterns of a wicked government or unrighteous government, wicked men and wicked leaders. And the Book of Mormon is great for that. Sometimes we think of it more in a religious nature, but there's plenty of political, if you will, substance found within the Book of Mormon. We'll go over just a little bit of that, and there's other references found within the Book of Mormon, but I feel that this is a great kind of some of those core verses, passages that we can find to that not only pattern Old Testament, the Old Testament rule of law and structure of government that God gave to the children of Israel, which I'll be going over in subsequent papers, but also too in Doctrine Covenants, where the Lord talks about the constitutional government that was set up in this land, speaking of the United States of America. So without further ado, let us continue. And to understand just kind of a basic, what is a republic, because we hear that word, republic versus democracy. Sometimes we hear it interchanged, but really there actually is a difference. And a republic, by a most agreed upon definition, is the voice of the people being known via elected representatives, that's important, within a rigid framework of constitutional law, or recognizing where the sovereignty resides, and that resides with the individual. Whereas a democracy, as we have a very well-known popular example was in Greece, the ancient Greek Empire, is the voice of the majority and relative consensus via elected representatives, or in other words, a mob rule, and there is no sovereignty residing within the individual because of the fact that if a majority of the people agree to something, then that's how it's going to be, aka mob rule. Whereas a republic, there is the voice of the people, which can be the majority, but also to the rights of the minority of the population is also protected via this a republic framework of system. And I figured I'd throw this in here. It's interchangeable with other presentations I have, but I think this really helps, especially when you'll understand why when we get into Mosiah 29, where King Mosiah II actually takes the current form of government and then he changes that completely. So here we have the Nephites who left Jerusalem 600 BC, or the group who would become known the Lehites. We had Lehi, his family, Nephi, Lam, and Lemuel, their mother, Sarai, etc., others, and Ishmael. That was about 600 BC. And then we have King Benjamin, about 130 to 124 BC, his reign. And then we have his son, King Mosiah II, he reigned from 124 to 91 BC. Then we have this other group known as the Mulekites. They left in 580 BC when the Babylonians actually were invading Jerusalem. And they left, and Mulek, who was the son of Zedekiah, he fled with a group of individuals, and they came here to the Promised Land by the Lord. And in a nutshell, they didn't take scriptures with them. We're not sure why. Their language became corrupted, and there's very little that we know about them. In fact, I believe there's like 30-something verses in the Book of Mormon that talks about them. And anyways, they went from about 587 BC and then to about 121 BC when the people of Limhi, which is this third group over here, remember they left in about 200 BC to reclaim the land of their fathers, and they went from about 200 BC to about 121 BC. And you remember Zeniff was the one that was overzealous. He wanted to reclaim the land of his forefathers. He reigned for about 40 years, and then he had a son, King Noah. And without getting into all that, it didn't work out very well. And then the son of King Noah, King Limhi, ruled for an additional 20. When they met up with the Mulekites, because they were trying to get their way back to King Benjamin and the Nephite people, they ran to the Mulekites, and the Mulekites, along with the people of Limhi, they went back to the Nephites, or King Mosiah, recounted all their stories and everything they'd gone through. And then lastly, this group of the Jaredites, they left the Tower of Babel, the whole separation of the languages, and there was some overlap, as you can see, between the end of their civilization. Some of the historians, they say about 500 BC, we're not quite sure, but there was obviously some clear overlap of the decline of their empire, whereas the Nephites landing in 600 BC into the Promised Land, and then the Mulekites in sometime after 587 BC. And brother of Jared was kind of the patriarchal ruler, and then he had a son of Riha, who was made their first king, and it went all through, which we have all that horrible bloodshed in the Book of Ether, down to Coriantumr, who was the last remaining leader of the Jaredite nation, which prophesied it would happen, and that he would see others come to this land. And he was found by the Mulekites. So, anyways, that's kind of setting the stage. You might want to go back, refer to this, just as you're trying to keep everything straight. But so, the reason why I'm giving this is you'll see in the next slide. So, this is where the change of government is proposed. The people of Limhi send out a search party to find Zarahemla, or the people of Zarahemla, remember the Mulekites, and instead they find Jaredite ruins and 24 gold plates. The Mulekites have a large stone containing writings and history of the Jaredites in the account of Coriantumr, as he lived with them for the space of 9 moons. And then King Mosiah when all these people come back together and they settle in the land with King Mosiah and his people, he is able to, because he has the gift of seership, interprets the Jaredite records and also hears about Zeniff and everything that transpired with King Noah and King Limhi's people. And so he's obviously, he has a lot that he has to account for, plus he's been a king for some time now. And so I think he's noticing, there's a lot happening and that will happen even after he steps down as king. And so he ends up gathering his people together and he asks them, what do you want? And they said, well, we want a king. And again, going back to the fact that he's now just, everyone's anxious to know why there's this mighty nation that was left in ruins and why it was destroyed. I think that gives him a pause to reflect on, is necessarily having kings a good thing? And something that you'll see on some of these slides is this Connections for Understanding. So from 600 to 550 BC, we basically, for lack of a better term, we have a patriarchal theocracy, where there's obviously Lehi. He's the father, the patriarch, and he's receiving revelation and things from the Lord. And then from 550 to 91 BC, we basically have then what is the king or the monarchy among the Nephite people. And then from 91 BC to 30 AD, we have the reign of the judges, or a Christian constitutional republic. And then beginning in 30 AD, we have basically complete government collapse, tribalism, and this is all due to the secret combinations. So going over that overview, we go back to Mosiah, and he has this huge burden. He's, like I say, he's looked at all these records and he's wondering what is the best thing to do, because clearly having a king doesn't always work out very well. He even says, if you could have a king like my father, King Benjamin, that'd be great. But I've just read this record of the Jaredites, and it led to a lot of bad things and hardship. And also you talked about King Noah and how that didn't work out very well for the group that left here some time ago. So we read here in verse 11, he says, "Therefore I will be your king the remainder of my days. Nevertheless, let us appoint judges to judge this people according to our law, and we will newly arrange the affairs of this people. For we will appoint wise men to be judges, that will judge this people according to the commandments of God. Now it is better that a man should be judged of God than of man, for the judgments of God are always just, but the judgments of man are not always just. Therefore, if it were possible that you could have just men to be your kings, who would establish the laws of God, and judge his people according to his commandments, yea, if you could have men for your kings, who would do even as my father Benjamin did for this people, I say unto you, this could always be the case. Then it would be expedient that you should always have kings to rule over you." And just for brevity's sake, you can read in verses 12 through 16. He goes over the righteous king's traits, their actions, judgments, and the consequences thereof. He then, in verses 17 through 23, and then 35 and 36 of Mosiah 29, King Mosiah goes over the unrighteous traits of a king, the actions, judgments, and the consequences. And it's pretty stark, the difference. So then, as he continues on, in Mosiah chapter 29, verse 25, I love this. He says, "Therefore choose by the choice of this people judges, that ye may be judged according to the law." And then he goes into what I've heard called, and I think it fits very good, the three witches. And the first one being, which the law, speaking of the law, which have been given you by our fathers. And then number two, which are correct. And then three, which are given them by the hand of the Lord. So kind of reading in between the lines, there's probably some laws that were given when the Nephites came to the Promised Land. But what we do know is they were practicing the law of Moses, and that was given well before Nephites' time, obviously to the prophet Moses, when he was trying to figure out how to rule and govern and do the administrative functions as it pertained to the children of Israel, and the Lord then revealed to him the more political or administrative portions of the law of Moses. Basically, has been coined God's law. So all these things were correct. And so that's what Mosiah is trying to get the people to understand. Like I say, by going through what it means to have a great king, but also what it means to have a not very righteous king, and even an unwise king. So he continues on to spell out the framework of this government. In verse 26 of Mosiah chapter 29, he says, "Now it is not common that the voice of the people desireth anything contrary to that which is right, but it is common for the lesser part of the people to desire that which is not right. Therefore, this shall ye observe and make it your law, to do your business by the voice of the people." Where it talks about, as we can see examples of when the people choose wickedness, the majority of the people, and that can be found in Helaman chapter 4, verses 20 through 24, and chapter 5, verse 2. And then he continues on, "And if the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time that he will visit you with great destruction, even as he has hitherto visited this land." And there's a great conference report by Elder President Hinckley, where he outlines, he says, sometimes this isn't always the majority, but in some cases the loud minority or special interest groups, lobbyists, etc. But essentially what Mosiah says is, it's true. There might be a few elitists or a small group of people that believe a certain way that are unrighteous, but for the most part, the majority of the people won't choose that which is evil. But when they do, then look out. He continues on in verses 28 through 31, where he outlines kind of a system of the judges to be set forth. And he says, if there's a lower judge that judges unrighteously, then let that decision or that judge be judged by even a higher judge. And if there's a group of higher judges that are unrighteous and trying to rule in wickedness, or a higher judge, then let a group of lower judges rule against them. So essentially, it's a wonderful system of checks and balances. Now, we don't have a lot of the very specific details. However, this is slightly different than the Old Testament judges, the Law of Moses judges, where there are a lot of more heroes, military leaders, whereas it's even slightly different from our Constitution today, where we have not only judges, but elected representatives and things of that nature. But nevertheless, it's the same. It has the same kind of outline of, again, not just one person, but the way to spread out the workload and the work of leadership and making decisions, as he outlines in verses 33 through 34. Essentially, the key to a successful government is that the burden should be upon all the people, that every man might bear his part. And this, I recommend reading the entire chapter of Mosiah 29. There's just, a lot to have to go over, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll have to move on. But he talks about men being accountable for their own sins and not as a collective whole, or the sins of the people rest upon one man, which would be with the case of an unrighteous king, where he causes much wickedness because of his actions and he has the sole control of the government. But let everyone have the sins be upon their own heads. And so, and I love the fact that anciently God revealed this, like I say, a similar system for Moses of Israel, where he says, quote, "Divide them," or families, "into tens, fifties, hundreds, and thousands." And so, looking at that, Moses essentially had 78,000 assistants to help govern and judge the children of Israel and execute the rule of law, or God's law. And I'll be going over that in greater detail in one of my subsequent videos or presentations. So, and what are these results of a free people? And Mosiah outlines this, and even Mormon gives some of his commentary. There's no inequality. It's a land of liberty, and every man is to enjoy rights and privileges, and every man is to bear his part or burden, and every man answers for his own sins. There's not this collectivist attitude or way of thinking. and that the sins of a society can't be blamed upon just one king who sends out laws and edicts and causes the people to sin, such as we had the example of King Noah. And the great part too that we see, it's very similar to today, is that the people can assemble in various bodies throughout the land, and that they can cast their votes or their voices for the judges. And so this is a great way, and obviously the people of King Mosiah, they go on, as it says, they were very happy. They had even that much more greater respect for King Mosiah, and they set up their system of government and were happy and peaceful and prosperous people. Now, looking at some of the contrast, there's always going to be opposition in all things, especially when it comes to freedom of religion, rights and privileges of the people, and agency. And so let's look at an example in Alma chapter 10, verses 17, 18, and 27. It's basically the foundations of destruction of a free people. In verse 17 it says, "Now they knew not that Amulek could know their designs, but it came to pass that they began to question him. He perceived their thoughts, and he said unto them, O ye wicked and perverse generation, you lawyers and hypocrites, for ye are laying the foundations of the devil, for ye are laying traps and snares to catch the holy ones of God. Yea, ye are laying plans to pervert the ways of righteousness, and to bring the wrath of God upon your heads, even to the utter destruction of this people. And now behold, I say unto you that the foundation of destruction of this people is beginning to be laid by the unrighteousness of your lawyers and your judges." So we can start to see at this point, not a few years later after the system of judges has been set up, that there's already people working in secret, in darkness, getting themselves into positions of power, and it's not going to work out well for the people. And if you can see that, fast forwarding in 3 Nephi 9:9, the Lord actually himself, it's very interesting when he's recounting all of the destruction of the people and naming off various cities. He calls out one city in particular. It's the city of Jacobugoth. I hope I pronounced that right. Where he says, "The wickedness was above all the wickedness above the whole earth, for it was they, lawyers and judges, etc., that did destroy the peace of my people and the government of the land." In other words, there were secret murders, secret combinations. So, not to say that that was the only city that had done that, but I find it interesting that that was recorded in the Holy Scriptures, that that was one of the reasons why this city, and it was above all the wickedness of all these other cities, even though the Lord mentions some of the sins of these other cities and why they're destroyed. So, moving on to the later accounts, where you're in some of these war chapters with Captain Moroni and whatnot. Alma 51, I find it interesting that in verse 2 of chapter 51, it says, "Nevertheless, they did not long maintain an entire peace in the land, for there began to be a contention among the people concerning the chief judge Pahoran. For behold, there were a part of the people who desired that a few particular points of the law should be altered." And now you'll recall that the chief judge Pahoran, he was just put into his position. He was a just man, as it says. And so I find it very interesting. Again, hearkening back to Mosiah, King Mosiah says, this needs to be the majority of the people. They're the ones that get to choose, and for the most part, they're going to choose righteousness. And then looking at Alma and Amulek, where they're talking in Alma 10 that we just read, there's people that are starting to lay the foundation of destruction. And it should be noted that a part of those people, they were kingmen, and also, too, these particular points of law that should be altered, we can see why they aren't altered, because in verse 3 it says, "But behold, Pahoran will not alter nor suffer the law to be altered." And it's been made clear that it should be, that these points of the law that should be altered were not in line with God's law. And if you look at the footnote, it takes you to Alma 1 verse 1, chapter 1 verse 1. And so Pahoran wouldn't suffer the law to be altered. Therefore he did not hearken to those who had sent in their voices with their petitions concerning the altering of the law. And you have to ask yourself, well, why not? Well, A, because it wasn't a righteous desire, but also it wasn't a majority consensus. And see verse 5 as well. Because of that, and let's kind of break down this definition of the kingmen. And in verse 8, it gives us that definition. They favored the kings. They were of high birth, sought to be kings, supported by those desiring power and authority over the people. Contrast that with the free men. They didn't want a king. They had covenanted, which is pretty powerful language right there, to maintain the rights and privileges of religion by a free government. And so, again, hearkening the scriptures to us in our day, do we see any of these same parallels with certain individuals or even groups, both political and non-political? And I think Elder Dallin H. Oaks summed that up pretty well in the connections for understanding. So, continuing on into the book of Helaman, we can definitely see some warnings for our day as they are written. So let us get straight into that. In Helaman chapter 6, verses 37 through 39, and it says, "And it came to pass that the Lamanites did hunt the band of robbers of Gadianton, and they did preach the word of God among the more wicked part of them, insomuch that this band of robbers was utterly destroyed from among the Lamanites." Now contrast that with what's happening with the Nephites. "And it came to pass, on the other hand, that the Nephites did build them up and support them, beginning at the more wicked part of them." So again, that small portion of society is the one that's taking part and lending that support until they had overspread all of the land of the Nephites. And then here's what's very interesting: "And had seduced the more part of the righteous, until they had come down to believe in their works, and partake of their spoils, and to join with them in their secret murders and combinations." And so we have to ask ourselves, are we seeing these similar things happening in our day? It is one thing to have the wicked support the secret combinations, but it is another to seduce the more righteous part of the people that allow for these things to happen. And if you look at just the next chapter, Helaman 7:6, this didn't happen. It happened in a very short period of time. In fact, only 4 years did they go from being very righteous to becoming very wicked. And so I thought about, how is this accomplished, taking the part of the more righteous, seduce the more righteous. Some of the things that I came up with were promises of power, lack of competition, so it could affect the trade and overall availability of resources, even the transfer of wealth along with incentives being provided via that transfer of wealth. So, and then in verse 39, this is very, very interesting, and Mormon's commentary is, "And thus they did obtain the sole management of the government, insomuch they did trample under the feet and smite and rend and turn their backs upon the poor and the meek and the humble followers of God." And something I think it's very interesting to point out is the definitions of smite and rend. And it's important. I went to the Webster's 1828 edition. Smite is to afflict, chasten, or punish, and rend is to separate or part with violence. So we could put those back in. It says they did trample under their feet and afflict or punish and separate with violence and turn their backs upon the poor and meek and also the humble followers of God. So I find that very curious that Mormon points that out and makes that distinction between the poor and the meek and then even the humble followers of God. But they're all receiving the same treatment from those that are wicked up in the upper echelons of government. And something, too, that occurred to me as I was preparing for this is how does those in power, how do they separate or afflict or punish people? And I thought sometimes it can be done through an invisible enemy, whatever that enemy may be or idea. And by doing so, especially with those that are poor and meek that are already more vulnerable, you can stir up violence and great contention. And then, of course, who's there to step in? Well, the government is. And it's the same thing with the humble followers of God. If you can separate and punish and those humble followers of God, it further erodes moral fibers of society and just weakens the nation as a whole, which further propels those that seek power and gain and wealth. It allows that even more control over society. And just a little side note, I think Hugh Nibley gives a great commencement speech about this very point titled Leaders and Managers, so check that out with that link below. Excuse me. So continuing on with that, about the warnings for our day, in 3 Nephi chapters 6 and 7, sorry about these notifications that keep coming up. And thus in the commencement of the 30th year, the people having been delivered up for the space of a long time, is about 9 years that they had gone from complete righteousness to now complete wickedness, to be carried about by the temptation of the devil, whithersoever he desired to carry them, and to do whatsoever iniquity he desired they should. And thus in the commencement of this, the 30th year of the reign of the judges, they were in a state of awful wickedness. And very important to take note of this. In verse 18, Mormon's commentary, now they did not sin ignorantly, for they knew the will of God concerning them, for it had been taught unto them. Therefore they did willfully rebel against God. And there's a difference between sinning in ignorance and willfully rebelling against God. And Mormon makes this clear distinction that these people, they knew what they should be doing, but they weren't doing it. Even the more righteous part, as it says, they were seduced to partake in the spoils, and they did so willfully. And going back to Mosiah, he says when the majority of the people choose wickedness, they better watch out, because God's gonna bring down the destruction and the judgments. And I really think Elder Down H. Oaks has penned this very well in a conference address of yesteryear. He said, quote, evil that used to be localized and covered like a boil is now legalized and paraded like a banner. The most fundamental roots and bulwarks of civilization are questioned or attacked. Nations disavow their religious heritage. Marriage and family responsibilities are discarded as impediments to personal indulgence. The movies and magazines and television that shape our attitudes are filled with stories or images that portray the children of God as predatory beasts, or at best as trivial creations pursuing little more than personal pleasure, and too many of us accept this as entertainment. What more can I say but amen to that statement by Elder Oaks. So, moving to some more Latter-day Scripture, there's a little God's own personal commentary on His own law, and he, again, kind of following the law of witnesses. He's done that so in the Old Testament. He did so in the Book of Mormon, and now he's reiterating points and doctrines of his law for the administration of political law, even economic and judicial. So in D&C section 98, verses 4 through 12, he goes just over this, and it reads, and now verily I say unto you concerning the laws of the land, it is my will that the people should observe to do all things whatsoever I command them. And the law of the land, which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, which is the constitutional law of the land, speaking of the Constitution of the United States of America. And as pertaining to the law of man, whatsoever is more or less in this cometh of evil. And just a little commentary, just because he's not necessarily saying anything that comes after this is going to be evil, but our Constitution is a beautiful framework of laws and articles and subsections, and so it does allow for the changing and addition of laws, policy, and procedure by proper means. However, you don't even have to be a constitutional law or political expert to see that this is not being followed at all in our modern politics, not only on a national level, but state and even county and local. in a lot of parts of this country, just people are just not following, or they're just trampling on how things should be done. So, and I feel that it's worth mentioning in D&C section 101, 77 through 80, the Lord again reiterates this, and talking about the wise men who put forth this constitution. They were raised up by the Lord for this exact purpose. And he also talks about that this belongs to all flesh. So he's not just speaking of all flesh doesn't live here in America. Eventually, his law is going to be part of the law that goes forth from the New Jerusalem. So, and it's going to be based upon this exact same framework of that our Constitution is. And so, looking at a quick list of what this constitutional law is, it supports the principle of freedom, maintains the rights and privileges that belongs to all mankind, justifiable before the Lord. The Lord even in this same section, he counsels how we should choose leaders. And he makes the contrast. He says to diligently seek them out, but then after they're in office, we need to observe to uphold these righteous and honest and wise men. And then he also gives us the admonition, anything less of this cometh of evil. And it really makes me think about when the wicked rule, the people mourn. And the Lord also makes mention of that. So, but so true, as we can see already in our quick study of passages within the Book of Mormon in certain leaders. So, and what is the role and responsibility of government under God's law? Well, this is a great section that can be found in Doctrine Covenants, section 134. And just for the sake of time, and perhaps even just a little bit of homework, and I think it's a great thing to study, and we get a lot out of it. And these are some of the questions that to look for, to answer in section 134. It says, well, this is the Lord speaking. He says, what should the governments preserve? What is the role of citizens, not just here in America? What is the role of religion, which I think is really quite fascinating? And what are some of the justified actions of citizens of a particular nation? And I'll just give a brief plug. I'll be having check out my other presentations about God's law. It's this series about the Latter-day Saints' perspective on God's law, principles, etc., and where I break down this particular section of D&C 134 as it relates to other great principles relating to God's law and what it means for our future. And finally, as always, I try and leave you on a positive note. Despite all the wickedness we might see around us, even when I wrote this in 2019, it was applicable then, and it's even applicable now more than ever, is that as we learn about from King Mosiah and even King Benjamin that came before, who was a very righteous king, they both understood, and so did Mormon and all the prophets of the Book of Mormon, and even Mormon, the author and editor of the Book of Mormon. They understood that the change has to come within. As much as we try and think that the government should dictate what people should and should not do, and limit agency or choice or responsibility, in the end, that's not how God wants it to be. And so I'll just leave with these two verses, and I think it's definitely a tale of two nations. And the first one is found in Mosiah chapter 29, verses 27. And if the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he hath hitherto visited this land. And then the next one is found in Ether 2, verse 12. And I love it. It's been one of my favorites for as long as I can remember. And it says, Behold, this is the Lord speaking to the brother of Jared. Behold, this is a choice land, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage and from captivity, and from all other nations under heaven, if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ, who hath been manifested by the things which we have written. And isn't that so true? We've seen that with the Jaredite record, in the Book of Ether. We've seen it time and time again throughout the Book of Mormon. We can see it now in our day. And the only way to prevent being swept off from this land to avoid the judgments of God is to do just that, to serve the God of this land, Jesus Christ. His gospel, his doctrine is what is going to save this world from utter and complete destruction. And it's up to us as members of his church to spread that message far and wide, that it is not to trust in the arm of the flesh, but to trust in him who is mighty to save, even Jesus Christ. And I leave you these things in his name, Jesus Christ.